My name is Charles Robinson. What I'm about to tell you happened to me in September of 2010, but the memory of it is as fresh as if it were yesterday. I worked as a backcountry ranger in Glacier National Park, Montana. It's about as wild and rugged a place as you can find in the lower 48. I'd seen my share of grizzlies and mountain lions over the years, but those encounters were straightforward, predictable. What I faced back then, there's no guidebook for that. The call came in on a crisp autumn morning. The air had that particular bite to it, hinting at the winter to come. I was in the ranger station, going through my usual morning routine, checking weather reports, trail conditions, and any overnight incident logs. The radio crackled to life, breaking the quiet. "Base, this is dispatch. We've got a report of a missing hiker near Iceberg Lake. Group of 5, one member unaccounted for since yesterday afternoon. Over." I grabbed the radio.
Dispatch, this is Ranger Robinson. I copy. Any more details? Over.
Negative, Ranger. Group's pretty shaken up. They're waiting at the Iceberg Lake trailhead. Ranger Hayes is already en route to meet you there. Over. 10-4, dispatch. I'm heading out now. Over and out. I quickly gathered my gear, first aid kit, extra water, emergency rations, and my trusty 30-06 rifle. In bear country, you never leave without it. As I headed out to my truck, I couldn't shake a feeling of unease. Missing hikers weren't uncommon, but something about this call felt different. The drive to the trailhead took about an hour. The road wound through towering pines and past crystal-clear streams. On any other day, I would have marveled at the beauty. Today, my mind was focused on the task at hand. I pulled into the parking lot and saw Amelia Hayes, my partner for this operation, already talking to a group of visibly distressed hikers. Amelia was relatively new to the job, but she had good instincts and a level head. I grabbed my pack and joined them. "Charles," Amelia nodded as I approached. "This is Mike, Sarah, Tom, and Lisa. Their friend John has been missing since yesterday afternoon." I looked at the group. They were in their mid-20s, dressed in decent hiking gear, but with the slightly overwhelmed look of city folks out of their element. "Can you tell me exactly what happened?" I asked. Mike, a tall guy with a scraggly beard, spoke up. "We were about 2 miles past Iceberg Lake, exploring some of the unmarked trails. John was a little ahead of us, maybe 50 yards. He went around a bend in the path, and then," Mike's voice cracked. Sarah, a petite blonde with red-rimmed eyes, continued, "We heard this sound. Not quite a scream, not quite a growl. Then John yelled, just once. By the time we got around the bend, he was gone. Just gone." "Did you see any signs of what might have taken him?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm and professional. Tom, a stocky guy with glasses, shook his head. "It happened so fast. We saw some disturbed underbrush, maybe a flash of movement deeper in the woods, but nothing clear." I exchanged a glance with Amelia. This wasn't sounding like a typical bear attack or a hiker simply getting lost. "Did you notice anything unusual in the area before John disappeared? Any strange noises, smells, tracks?" The group looked at each other uneasily. Finally, Lisa, a tall woman with long dark hair, spoke up. "There was something off about the woods there. It was too quiet. No bird sounds, no squirrels. And there was this smell, like rotting meat, but also something else, something I can't describe." I nodded, trying not to let my growing concern show on my face. "All right, here's what we're going to do. Amelia and I are going to head up the trail and see if we can find any sign of John. I need you all to stay here. If we're not back in 4 hours, use the emergency radio in my truck to call for backup. Understood?" They nodded, looking relieved to have professionals taking over. As Amelia and I started up the trail, I could feel their eyes on our backs, full of hope and fear. The hike to Iceberg Lake was beautiful, but tense. Neither of us spoke much, our senses on high alert for any sign of trouble. The lake itself was a stunning sight, a sheet of turquoise water surrounded by towering cliffs. But we didn't have time to admire the view. We pushed on past the lake, following the faint trail the hikers had described. About 2 miles in, we started to notice changes. The forest grew denser, the underbrush thicker, and it was quiet, too quiet. "Charles," Amelia whispered, "do you smell that?" I nodded grimly. The air had taken on a foul odor, just as Lisa had described, like decay, but with an underlying scent that made my skin crawl. We pressed on, moving slowly, our eyes scanning the woods around us. That's when we found the first sign of John. A scrap of cloth, caught on a thorny bush. It was stained with what could only be blood, Amelia bagged it as evidence, her hands shaking slightly. We followed a trail of broken branches and disturbed earth. Whatever had taken John, it was big, and it hadn't been subtle about its passage. The trail led us deeper into the woods, away from any marked paths. As the day wore on, the forest seemed to close in around us. The towering pines blocked out most of the sunlight, creating an eerie twilight. Every shadow seemed to move. Every rustle of leaves made us jump. "Charles," Amelia said, her voice tense, "what do you think we're dealing with here? This doesn't feel like any animal attack I've ever seen." I shook my head. "I don't know, Amelia. In all my years as a ranger, I've never seen anything like this. But whatever it is, we need to find it before it hurts anyone else." We pushed on, the sense of wrongness growing with each step. The smell was getting stronger, and now there was something else. A sound, just at the edge of hearing, like breathing, but wrong. Too deep, too rhythmic for any animal I knew. As we rounded a bend in our makeshift trail, we came upon a clearing. What we saw there will haunt me for the rest of my days. In the center of the clearing was a crude structure, like a nest made of broken branches and bones. Animal bones, mostly, but some looked disturbingly human. And there, half buried in the nest, was a backpack. John's backpack. Amelia started forward, but I grabbed her arm. "Wait," I whispered. "Look." At the edge of the clearing, half hidden in the shadows, was something. It was tall, much taller than a man, with limbs that seemed too long, too jointed. Its skin was a mottled gray-green, like the moss on the trees around us, and its eyes, God, its eyes. They glowed a sickly yellow-green in the gloom, fixed right on us. For a moment, everything was still. Then the creature moved, faster than anything that size had a right to. It lunged across the clearing, those impossibly long arms reaching for us. I shoved Amelia to one side and dove the other way, bringing my rifle up as I rolled. I fired, the sound deafening in the quiet forest. The creature shrieked, a sound that made my bones vibrate, and stumbled back. "Run!" I yelled to Amelia. We took off, crashing through the underbrush. I could hear the creature behind us, its inhuman shrieks echoing through the trees. We ran until our lungs burned, until our legs felt like lead. Finally, we burst out onto the main trail, nearly colliding with a group of startled hikers. "Call for backup," I gasped, gesturing wildly at their satellite phone. "Emergency!" As one of the hikers made the call, Amelia and I turned to face the woods, our weapons ready. But the creature didn't emerge. The forest was silent once more. The next few hours were a blur of activity. Park rangers and local law enforcement swarmed the area. Search parties were organized. But despite an extensive search, no trace of John was ever found. And the creature, well, the official report chalked it up to a bear attack. Said Amelia and I had been confused, stressed, seeing things that weren't there. But I know what I saw. That thing in the woods. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything natural. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear that breathing again, just outside my window. That deep rhythmic sound that's almost but not quite human. I retired from the Park Service not long after that incident. Couldn't handle the skeptical looks, the whispers behind my back. Moved down to Arizona. Took up a job as a tour guide in the desert. It's safer here, mostly. No dark forests, no deep shadows for things to hide in. But I can't forget, and I can't shake the feeling that someday, somehow, I'll see those glowing eyes again. So I keep my rifle clean and loaded, just in case. Because out there in the wild places, in the deep woods and high mountains, there are things that defy explanation, things that hunt in the shadows, that prey on the unwary, and all the training in the world can't prepare you for the moment when you realize that you're not the top of the food chain anymore. So if you're ever out in the backcountry, and the forest goes quiet, and you catch a whiff of something rotting on the wind, don't investigate. Don't try to be a hero. Just run. Run and don't look back. Because there are some things in this world that man was never meant to face. And once you've seen them, you can never unsee them. This is Charles Robinson, former backcountry ranger of Glacier National Park, signing off. Stay safe out there, folks. And always remember, in the wild, you're not always the hunter. Sometimes, you're the prey. Based on the title, you're probably thinking this story is about a creepy old abandoned cabin. That assumption would be completely wrong. The cabin I'm about to tell you about is actually very modern, built just 12 years ago with all the latest amenities and technology. My friend Jordan still lives there with his family to this day, though I often wonder how they manage it. The cabin sits in one of the most beautiful parts of northern Idaho, positioned perfectly alongside the rushing waters of the Clearwater River. The structure itself is impressive. 3 stories of contemporary architecture with floor-to-ceiling windows, exposed wooden beams, and a wraparound deck that offers breathtaking views of the surrounding wilderness. Jordan and his family moved there in early 2015, drawn by the isolation and natural beauty that the property offered. When I first met Jordan in college, he would often talk about his family's retreat home. He described it as paradise, a place where you could escape from the chaos of modern life and reconnect with nature. The way he painted the picture, I imagined lazy summer afternoons fishing in the river, evening barbecues on the deck, and peaceful nights listening to the sound of flowing water and rustling leaves. What's not to like about living in such a magnificent place, surrounded by nothing but pristine wilderness and the gentle sounds of nature? Well, as I would soon discover, there was quite a lot not to like. The isolation that seemed so appealing from a distance became something entirely different when experienced firsthand, especially when darkness fell and the true nature of the place began to reveal itself. The first time Jordan invited me to spend a weekend at the cabin, I was genuinely excited. This was in September 2015, about 2 months after we had become friends. I packed my bags eagerly, looking forward to what I assumed would be a relaxing getaway. The drive up to the property took nearly 4 hours from Boise, winding through increasingly remote mountain roads until we finally turned onto a gravel driveway that seemed to stretch on forever. When the cabin finally came into view, I had to admit it was stunning. The modern design contrasted beautifully with the rustic surroundings, and the way the late afternoon sun reflected off the river created an almost magical atmosphere. Jordan's parents, who had been living there full-time since his father's early retirement, greeted us warmly. His mother, Patricia, was a kind woman in her late 50s who seemed genuinely happy to have company. His father, Dennis, was more reserved but friendly enough. As we carried my bags inside, I marveled at the interior. The main living area featured vaulted ceilings, a massive stone fireplace, and furniture that looked like it belonged in a high-end lodge. The kitchen was equipped with professional-grade appliances, and the dining area could easily seat 12 people. Everything was perfect, almost too perfect, as if the family was trying very hard to create an impression of normalcy and comfort. But even during that first evening, I noticed small things that seemed odd. Patricia would frequently glance toward the staircase leading to the upper floors, as if expecting someone to come down. Dennis had installed an unusual number of motion sensor lights around the property, claiming they were necessary for security, though we were literally miles from the nearest neighbor. And Jordan himself seemed more tense than usual, though he attributed it to school stress. That first night, Jordan showed me around the house, saving his pride and joy for last. A fully equipped home theater on the basement level. The room was impressive, with a professional-grade projector, surround sound system, and theater seating for 8 people. The walls were painted a deep burgundy, and heavy curtains blocked out any outside light when closed. Jordan had spent considerable time and money creating what he called his perfect movie experience. However, there was something unsettling about the space when the projector and screen were not in use. The room felt oppressively dark, even with the recessed lighting turned on. The burgundy walls seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating shadows in corners that appeared deeper than they should have been. The air felt heavier down there, thicker somehow, as if the ventilation system couldn't quite manage to circulate fresh air properly. We decided to spend the evening playing video games on Jordan's PlayStation 5, which was connected to the theater's massive screen. The game we chose was a racing simulator. Nothing scary or intense, just some friendly competition to pass the time. The surround sound made every engine rev and tire screech feel incredibly realistic, and for a while, I was genuinely enjoying myself. We had been playing for about an hour when something happened that I still can't fully explain. We were in the middle of a particularly competitive race when the PlayStation console suddenly shut off completely. Not just the game, the entire system powered down as if someone had unplugged it from the wall. The sudden silence in the room was deafening after the constant noise of the racing game. The lights in the theater were dimmed to enhance the gaming experience, so the room wasn't in complete darkness, but it wasn't well lit either. There was just enough illumination to make out the general shapes of furniture and equipment, but details were lost in the murky atmosphere. Everything seemed to take on an ominous quality in that reduced lighting, as if ordinary objects were transformed into something more threatening. I turned to Jordan to make some joke about the power going out, but the words died in my throat when I saw his face. The color had drained from his complexion so completely that he looked like he was about to be sick. His eyes were fixed on something behind me, and his mouth was slightly open in what appeared to be shock or terror. He wasn't looking at me at all. His gaze was focused intently on a point somewhere over my left shoulder. "We need to leave this room right now," he said in a voice that was barely above a whisper, but carried an urgency that made my heart start beating faster. He didn't explain why, didn't wait for questions, just stood up slowly and deliberately, never taking his eyes off whatever he was seeing behind me. Every instinct told me to turn around and look, to see what had captured his attention so completely, but something in his expression warned me against it. Instead, I followed his lead and stood up carefully, fighting the overwhelming urge to spin around and confront whatever was there. The feeling of being watched, of having someone or something directly behind me, was so intense it was almost unbearable. We moved toward the door with deliberate slowness, Jordan slightly ahead of me but constantly glancing back to monitor whatever he was seeing. The walk to the exit felt like it took forever, though it couldn't have been more than 10 seconds. Every step felt measured and careful, as if sudden movement might trigger some kind of response from whatever presence had joined us in that room. Once we were safely out of the theater and had climbed the stairs to the main floor, I immediately demanded an explanation. Jordan closed the basement door firmly behind us and engaged the lock, something I noticed he did with particular care, as if he was securing something dangerous rather than simply closing off a room. "What exactly did you see down there?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through my system. Jordan ran his hands through his hair and took a deep breath before answering. "After the PlayStation shut off," he began, "I saw the silhouette of a man standing directly behind you. Not just a shadow or a trick of the light, a distinct human shape, tall and broad-shouldered, standing maybe 2 feet behind your chair." The way he described it, with such specific detail and absolute certainty, made my skin crawl. I found myself unconsciously reaching back to touch my shoulders, as if I might still feel the presence of whoever or whatever had been looming behind me. "The figure wasn't moving," Jordan continued. "Just standing there, perfectly still, like it was watching us play. But here's the thing that really scared me. I could see through it slightly, like it wasn't completely solid, but it was definitely there. And when I looked directly at it, I got the feeling that it knew I could see it." This revelation opened the floodgates, and Jordan began telling me about other incidents that had been occurring in the house, things that had been happening for years, ever since his family had moved in. As he spoke, I realized that our experience in the theater room was just the tip of the iceberg, a minor incident compared to the ongoing supernatural activity that plagued the property. He told me about the nightly disturbances in his bedroom that occurred with clockwork regularity. Every night at approximately 5 in the morning, the door to his room would begin opening and closing repeatedly. Not just once or twice, but continuously for about 5 minutes, as if someone was playing an extremely persistent and disturbing prank. The sound would wake him every time. The creak of hinges, the click of the latch, the soft thud as the door met the frame. Initially, Jordan had assumed it was a problem with the house settling or perhaps air pressure changes affecting the door mechanism. But when he mentioned it to his father, Dennis revealed that he had personally installed and adjusted that door, ensuring it was perfectly balanced and properly latched. There was no mechanical reason for it to behave that way. Even more disturbing were the incidents that occurred when Jordan ventured outside alone. On multiple occasions, usually during late evening or early morning hours, he would hear his own voice calling to him from deep in the woods. Not just someone calling his name, but his actual voice, with his exact intonation and speech patterns, shouting from somewhere in the dark forest that surrounded the property. "The first time it happened," Jordan explained, "I actually answered back thinking maybe there was some kind of echo effect I didn't understand. But the voice would respond, having conversations with me, asking me to come into the woods. It knew things about me, personal things, and it would use that information to try to convince me to leave the safety of the yard. The most recent incident had occurred just a few weeks before my visit. Jordan and I had been talking on a video call when both of us heard distinct laughter in the background of his audio feed. It was the unmistakable sound of a child giggling, high-pitched and gleeful, but there were no children in the house at the time. Jordan was alone, his parents having gone into town for supplies. When I asked him about it during the call, Jordan had looked genuinely confused and slightly frightened. He muted his microphone and spent several minutes searching the house, checking every room, every closet, every possible hiding place. He found nothing, but the laughter had been clear and distinct, definitely coming from somewhere inside the house. As Jordan continued sharing these experiences, I began to understand why he had seemed so tense during my visit. Living with this kind of constant supernatural activity would be exhausting for anyone, but he had been dealing with it for months without telling anyone, probably worried that people would think he was losing his mind. The mystery deepened when he told me about an encounter his family had during their first summer at the property. Because the cabin sat directly beside the Clearwater River, it was common for rafting groups to use their backyard as a rest stop or launching point. Jordan's family had always been welcoming to these river enthusiasts, often providing cold drinks and allowing people to use their restroom facilities. One particular family had stopped by on a beautiful July afternoon in 2015, just a few months after Jordan's family had moved in. They were an older couple with 2 teenage children, friendly and appreciative of the hospitality. During their brief visit, they mentioned how pleased they were to finally see the house occupied and showing signs of life. This comment confused Patricia, who explained that the house had been lived in continuously before their family purchased it. The previous owners had been an elderly couple named the Hendersons, who had built the house and lived there for nearly a decade before deciding to downsize and move closer to their grandchildren. But the rafting family insisted that wasn't what they had observed during their regular trips down the river. "We've been coming down this stretch of water for 15 years, the father had explained. And that house has been dark and empty-looking for at least the last 5 years. All the windows were always covered, no lights were ever on, and we never saw any signs of people living there." This contradiction bothered Patricia enough that she decided to do some research. She contacted the Hendersons directly, and they confirmed that they had indeed lived in the house continuously until the sale. Mrs. Henderson was particularly adamant about this point, explaining that they had loved the house and only left reluctantly due to age-related mobility issues. "But here's where it gets really strange," Jordan continued. "When my mom asked Mrs. Henderson about the windows being covered, she insisted they had never covered their windows. She said they loved the natural light and the views of the river too much to ever block them out. She also mentioned that they kept lights on in the evening, specifically because they enjoyed watching the sunset reflect off the water." The contradiction was impossible to reconcile. Either the rafting family was mistaken about what they had observed year after year, or something had been preventing the house from appearing occupied even when people were living there normally. Neither explanation made complete sense, but combined with the supernatural incidents Jordan's family was experiencing, it suggested that whatever presence haunted the property had been active for quite some time. Dennis had tried to investigate the history of the land before the house was built, but records for such remote properties were often incomplete. What he did discover was that the area had been used as hunting grounds by various Native American tribes for centuries, and there had been a small logging operation in the vicinity during the early 1900s. Beyond that, the land had remained largely undeveloped wilderness. Over the following months, I stayed in regular contact with Jordan, and the supernatural activity at the cabin seemed to be intensifying rather than diminishing. What had started as occasional strange incidents was becoming a daily part of life for his family, and the psychological toll was becoming increasingly apparent. The nighttime disturbances in Jordan's bedroom had evolved beyond just the door opening and closing. He began waking to find his furniture rearranged, not dramatically but subtly enough that he would notice something was different. His desk chair would be turned to face the bed instead of the desk. Books on his shelf would be in different positions than where he had left them. His clothes would be laid out on the floor in neat arrangements, as if someone was carefully organizing them while he slept. Patricia started reporting similar incidents throughout the house. Kitchen utensils would be found in wrong drawers, always placed with deliberate care rather than carelessly tossed. Picture frames would be turned to face the wall, but only certain ones, and always the photographs that showed the family looking happy or relaxed. It was as if whatever presence inhabited the house disapproved of their contentment. The incidents outside the house became more frequent and more aggressive. Dennis installed motion sensor cameras around the property perimeter, hoping to document whatever was causing the disturbances. The cameras captured hours of footage, showing lights turning on in response to movement, but the video never showed what was triggering the sensors. Trees would sway without wind, and snow would show footprint patterns that appeared and disappeared between camera cycles. One particularly disturbing piece of footage showed the back deck furniture being systematically rearranged over the course of an hour. Chairs were moved to form circles, tables were flipped upside down, and cushions were arranged in specific patterns. But the cameras never captured any person or thing actually moving the furniture. The items simply appeared in new positions each time the motion sensors triggered. Jordan's experience with hearing his own voice from the woods became a nightly occurrence. The voice would call out just after sunset, always from the same general direction, always using his exact vocal patterns and inflections. But the conversations became more sophisticated and more disturbing. The voice began referencing private conversations Jordan had with family members, repeating things that had been said inside the house where no outsider could have overheard. "It's not just mimicking my voice anymore," Jordan told me during one particularly distressing phone call. "It's like whatever this thing is has been listening to everything we say, learning about us, studying our family dynamics. Last night, it started telling me things about my parents' relationship that I didn't even know, private things they had discussed when they thought no one was listening." The psychological impact on the family was becoming severe. Patricia developed chronic insomnia, afraid to fall asleep because she would inevitably wake to find evidence that someone or something had been in the house while the family slept. Dennis became obsessed with installing additional security measures. More cameras, better locks, motion sensors inside the house as well as outside. But none of these precautions seemed to deter whatever was tormenting them. Jordan's grades began suffering as the lack of quality sleep and constant stress affected his ability to concentrate. He started spending more time away from the house, often staying overnight with friends or camping out in his car rather than returning home. But even when he was away, he would receive text messages from his parents describing new incidents that occurred in his absence. By December 2015, the situation had become unbearable for Jordan's family. Dennis decided to take a more systematic approach to understanding what was happening. He contacted the local sheriff's department, but their response was predictably skeptical. Without evidence of actual criminal activity or property damage, there was little they could do beyond suggesting the family install additional security measures. Dennis then reached out to the County Historical Society, hoping to learn more about the land's history before the house was built. What he discovered was both fascinating and deeply troubling. The area where the cabin sat had indeed been used by indigenous peoples for centuries, but it had specifically been avoided for permanent settlements due to what tribal elders described as restless spirits that inhabited the woods. According to the historical records, early European settlers had also reported strange incidents in the area. A logging camp established in 1902 had been abandoned after just 6 months due to what the foreman described as unnatural disturbances that made it impossible for workers to sleep or focus on their tasks. Tools would go missing and reappear in impossible locations, voices would call out from empty areas of the forest, and several workers reported seeing figures moving through the trees that would vanish when approached directly. The most significant discovery came from a newspaper archive dating back to 1957. A hunting cabin had been built roughly a quarter mile from where Jordan's family's house now stood. The article described how the cabin's occupants, a family of 4 who used it as a weekend retreat, had all died in their sleep during what was supposed to be a relaxing February vacation. The official cause of death was listed as carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty heating system, but the article included quotes from the investigating officers that raised disturbing questions. The family members had been found in different rooms of the cabin, as if they had been trying to escape something. The front door was found wide open despite the freezing temperatures, and several windows had been broken from the inside. Most unsettling of all, neighbors who had discovered the bodies reported that the family's car was found running in the driveway with the headlights on, as if someone had been trying to leave in the middle of the night but never made it out of the property. Dennis shared this information with Patricia and Jordan, and they began to understand that their experiences were part of a much larger pattern of supernatural activity that had been affecting the area for decades, possibly centuries. The realization was both validating, they weren't losing their minds, and terrifying, they were dealing with something that had apparently driven people away or worse for generations. The winter of 2015-2016 brought the supernatural activity to a crescendo that would ultimately force Jordan's family to make an impossible decision. The incidents were no longer confined to specific times or locations within the house. They were happening constantly, affecting every aspect of daily life. January brought what Jordan described as the most terrifying night of his life. He woke at his usual 5 a.m. to the sound of his bedroom door opening and closing. But this time the activity didn't stop after 5 minutes. It continued for over an hour, accompanied by footsteps in the hallway that seemed to pace back and forth outside his room. When Jordan finally worked up the courage to open the door and investigate, he found the hallway empty, but noticed that every other door on the second floor was now standing wide open. His parents' bedroom, the guest rooms, the bathrooms, even the linen closet, all of them had been opened during the night. But his parents were still asleep in their room, and they insisted the next morning that they hadn't heard anything unusual. The kitchen became a particular focus of supernatural attention. Patricia would wake each morning to find elaborate arrangements of dishes, utensils, and food items covering every available surface. Not messy or destructive arrangements, but carefully planned displays that looked almost like altar offerings. Candles that the family didn't own would appear lit on the counters. Fresh flowers would be arranged in vases, despite the fact that it was the middle of winter and no flowers were growing anywhere on the property. The voice in the woods became more persistent and more demanding. It no longer just called Jordan's name or tried to engage him in conversation. Now it would scream his name repeatedly for hours at a time, sometimes continuing from sunset until dawn. The voice developed an angry, desperate quality that made it sound less like mimicry and more like an actual person in distress. It started saying things that made me think it was trapped somehow, Jordan explained during one of our phone conversations. It would beg me to help it, claim that it needed me to come into the woods so it could go home. But there was something wrong about the way it said these things, like it was reading from a script rather than expressing genuine emotion. The most disturbing incident occurred in February 2016, exactly 1 year after the historical cabin deaths that Dennis had discovered in his research. Jordan woke in the middle of the night to find his bedroom filled with an overwhelming smell of smoke, despite the fact that no fires were burning anywhere in the house. The smoke smell was so intense that he could barely breathe, and his eyes began watering immediately. He stumbled to his bedroom door, intending to wake his parents and evacuate the house, but found that the door would not open. The handle turned freely, and he could hear the latch mechanism operating normally, but the door remained firmly closed, as if something was holding it shut from the outside. He pounded on the door and shouted for help, but his parents' room was directly across the hall, and they later insisted they had heard nothing. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the smoke smell began to dissipate, and the door suddenly opened normally. Jordan rushed to check on his parents and found them sleeping peacefully, unaware that anything had happened. A search of the entire house revealed no source for the smoke smell, and none of the family's smoke detectors had been triggered. By March 2016, the psychological and physical toll of living in the cabin had become unbearable for Jordan's family. Patricia had lost nearly 20 pounds due to stress and lack of sleep. Dennis had developed a nervous habit of constantly checking locks and security cameras, even when he was away from the house. Jordan was struggling to maintain his grades and had developed anxiety severe enough to require medication. The final incident that convinced them to leave occurred on a Sunday evening in late March. The family was gathered in the living room watching television when every electronic device in the house began operating simultaneously. The kitchen appliances all turned on at once. The blender, coffee maker, microwave, and dishwasher all running at maximum settings. Upstairs, radios began playing different stations at full volume. The home theater system activated and began cycling through inputs, producing a chaotic mix of sounds and static. But most frightening of all, the house's intercom system began broadcasting the conversations the family was having in the living room, playing their words back to them with a several-second delay. They could hear their own voices coming through speakers throughout the house, creating an echo effect that made normal conversation impossible. The electrical chaos continued for nearly an hour, despite Dennis's attempts to shut down the main breaker. Even with the power cut off, several battery-operated devices continued functioning, including smoke detectors that began shrieking randomly and a weather radio that began broadcasting what sounded like emergency alerts in languages none of them recognized. When the activity finally stopped, the house fell into a silence so complete and oppressive that it felt more threatening than the previous chaos. The family spent that night in a hotel in town, and they never spent another night in the cabin. The process of moving out took several months, partly due to the remote location and partly because of ongoing supernatural interference. Moving crews reported equipment malfunctions, unexplained accidents, and several workers quit after experiencing what they described as overwhelming feelings of dread while working on the property. Jordan's family eventually sold the house at a significant loss to a couple from California who were looking for a remote retreat property. During the sales process, Dennis felt obligated to disclose the supernatural activity they had experienced, but the buyers dismissed these accounts as products of isolation and imagination. Jordan maintains contact with the area through local social media groups, and he keeps track of what happens to the property. The California couple lasted less than 6 months before putting the house back on the market. Since then, it has been sold 3 more times, with each ownership period lasting less than a year. The house currently sits empty again, just as the Rafting family had described seeing it years before Jordan's family moved in. Local real estate agents have stopped trying to market the property actively, and it has developed a reputation in the area as that haunted house by the river. Jordan and his family eventually settled in Arizona, as far from the Idaho wilderness as they could manage while staying in the western United States. They rarely speak about their experiences at the cabin, though Jordan still wakes up at 5 a.m. sometimes, expecting to hear his bedroom door opening and closing. When people ask him about the most remote place he's ever lived, Jordan just smiles and changes the subject. He's never returned to Idaho, and he has no plans to ever go back. Some places, he says, are meant to be left alone, and some questions are better left unanswered. The cabin still stands by the river, its modern design and beautiful setting unchanged. But the windows remain dark, and rafters who pass by report the same emptiness that was observed decades ago. Whatever haunts that property continues to wait, patient and persistent, for the next family brave enough or foolish enough to call it home. As for what happened there to make it so haunted, that question continues to plague Jordan's thoughts. But after everything his family endured, he's no longer certain he wants to know the answer. The hunting cabin was just as I remembered it. It was tiny, hardly bigger than a tool shed, and after a year of neglect, dust now coated every surface. I hadn't been there in almost 10 years, not since the last time I went hunting with my grandfather Joseph. I'd been so terrified by the thing we saw in the woods there that I hadn't wanted to return, and my parents just assumed I was too bored to want to spend 2 weeks with a boring old man. But Gramps still came to visit us. Thankfully, we never went there. When Gramps passed away a year ago, he left the cabin and the 30 acres surrounding it to his only remaining grandchild. At 28 years old, I had never expected to set foot on the rural mountainside again, much less inherit it. But a bad breakup had left me with the decision of moving into the cabin or into my parents' basement. The choice had almost been hard to make. The local newspaper, the Highland Times, had claimed that Gramps died of a bear attack while out chopping firewood behind his cabin. I didn't really buy that story, though, and even as I pulled my beat-up old Ford into the unpaved driveway, I had my hand on my rifle. Though if that thing came back, I was sure it wouldn't do much to it, but still, it made me feel better. I hadn't seen it in a decade, but if that creature was still out there, I would be prepared this time, at least I hoped. Several hours later, I was unpacked and the cabin was decently clean. All of the utilities were still hooked up, and the refrigerator was well stocked. I had taken the week off of work to adjust to my new life. I was planning on just relaxing for the next few days. My first night and day passed uneventfully, but by the second night, things were getting a little weird. The isolation was immediate and overwhelming. The cabin sat nestled in a clearing, surrounded by towering pines that blocked out most of the sunlight during the day and created impenetrable darkness at night. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, and the small town of Highland Ridge was a good 10-mile drive down winding mountain roads. Cell service was spotty at best, and the ancient landline phone crackled with static whenever I tried to use it. That first evening, I sat on the porch with a beer, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. As darkness fell, the forest came alive with sounds: crickets chirping, owls hooting, and the occasional rustling in the underbrush. Normal sounds, expected sounds. But as the night deepened, the forest grew unnaturally quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I told myself it was nothing. Just my imagination playing tricks on me, fueled by childhood memories and the knowledge of how my grandfather had died. I went inside, locked the door, and tried to sleep. I had spent enough time in the country as a child to be familiar with the wildlife here. Raccoons, skunks, bears, other mammals, but the freshly made claw marks on the side of the cabin, they weren't anything that I recognized. I woke up on my third morning to gouges in the wood, and I was definitely unnerved. They were too large to belong to any small critters, and far too high up to be from coyotes. They were even too wide to be a mountain lion or bear. In this neck of the woods, that ruled out everything logical. As I studied the claw marks, I wondered how I could have slept through them being made. They definitely hadn't been there when I first arrived, and the fresh marks stood out in a bright contrast to the weathered wood of the cabin walls. I supposed a human could have made them with a knife, but I didn't have neighbors for miles. Who would be skulking around out here just to prank me like this? It didn't make any sense. It crossed my mind that maybe my ex might have done it just to freak me out. But Veronica lived almost 50 miles away and did not have the address for the cabin in the first place. I don't use social media enough to bother listing my new address, and we didn't have friends in common or anything like that. I eventually shrugged it off, deciding to let it go. I knew that worrying about it wouldn't help. That afternoon, though, I found myself driving the 10 miles into town and buying some motion-activated floodlights and a motion-sensing camera. 2 more nights passed, and each morning I woke up to the claw marks getting closer and closer to the cabin door. As much as I wanted to believe it was a prank, I had to admit to myself that the evidence was overwhelmingly against that idea. The floodlights would turn on, and the camera would snap. Yet somehow, all I would ever see in the photos was an empty yard. I had even tried to set up a video on my phone, but all it managed to capture was a vague blur of movement at the edge of the screen. The blur was elongated, taller than a person should be, with what looked like unnaturally long limbs. The image made my stomach twist into knots. The marks continued to appear, now accompanied by other disturbances. One morning I found the garden soil disturbed, as if something had been digging. Another day, I discovered a pile of small animal bones arranged in a bizarre pattern near the woodpile. Each night, whatever was out there seemed to be growing bolder, coming closer to the cabin, leaving more evidence of its presence. I began to notice other things too. Sometimes the cabin creaked and groaned at night, but not in the way old structures typically do. These sounds were rhythmic, almost deliberate. When I went to investigate, I found nothing, but the air felt different, heavier, charged with a presence I couldn't see but could definitely feel. On the 5th night, the temperature dropped unexpectedly. A strange fog rolled in from the woods, creeping across the clearing like ghostly fingers reaching for the cabin. I sat by the window, watching it swirl and dance in the moonlight, forming shapes that seemed almost human before dissolving back into mist. That was when I first heard the whispering. I had enough. On the 5th night, I went outside, rifle in hand, settling comfortably on the porch steps. There was no noise, no sound to indicate that the usual nocturnal critters were up and about. I shut all the lights off and waited for the creature that I knew would come. The fog had thickened, wrapping around the trees like a shroud. The forest beyond the clearing was a wall of impenetrable darkness. The moon, nearly full, cast an eerie glow that made the fog luminescent. I checked my rifle for the 10th time, making sure it was loaded and ready. Hours passed, and as 1 a.m. rolled around, I snapped myself out of a doze. The whispering had returned, faint but unmistakable. Words I couldn't quite make out, spoken in a voice that sounded disturbingly familiar. I strained to hear, to understand, but the words remained just beyond comprehension. Then I could hear something moving quietly out by the edge of the woods, where I could make out a figure skulking about, its features hidden in the shadows. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I was certain whatever was out there could hear it. My mouth went dry and my palms grew slick with sweat, making it difficult to maintain my grip on the rifle. The figure moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, sometimes on two legs, sometimes dropping to all fours. It circled the clearing, staying just at the edge of visibility. I raised the rifle, trying to get it in my sights, but it moved too erratically, too quickly. As the animal drew closer, I rubbed my eyes in disbelief, because there stood Joseph, my supposedly dead grandpa. He wasn't wearing any clothes. He paused mid-step, his head slowly turning to face me, probably hearing me gasp from shock. Grandpa looked sickly, with skin pale and ribs visible. He was bald now, his once robust beard and hair gone. "Grandpa?" I called out. I could hear the quiver in my own voice, and my hands were shaking from terror. The rifle had fallen to my lap, nearly forgotten in the intensity of seeing my presumably dead grandfather. I'd been so convinced that what I was about to see would be that antlered creature that I saw years ago. The one I knew killed Joseph. But I never considered once that my grandpa was still alive. "Grandpa, what are you doing? Come inside." Tears were streaming down my cheeks. I didn't care what my grandfather had been doing this whole time or why he was out there. All I cared about was that he was still alive. I wanted to hug him again. "You stupid boy. It's too late." His voice barely sounded human anymore. His voice came out all wrong, like someone trying to remember how to speak after years of silence. The words were formed correctly, but the cadence, the tone, everything was off. And before I could respond, Grandpa was bounding into the woods on all fours. He was gone in the blink of an eye, the bushes hardly swaying where he had passed through. The woods remained as eerily silent as they had been before, even though my grandfather's retreat should have made a large amount of noise. Not a second later, a low growl came from behind me, the sound reverberating off the cabin walls. A massive creature, the one that I remembered, approached from the side of the cabin. Within seconds, it became clear to me that it wasn't a human or an animal, unless someone was wearing an amazing and terrifying costume. The creature was every bit as surreal as I remembered. Long, pale limbs sprouted from an emaciated torso. An ivory deer skull shined in what little moonlight managed to bleed out through the clouds. It was wearing ragged old buckskin leggings and had beads around its neck. I could not see its eyes, though, but I knew without a doubt that if it had any, it was staring directly at me. I knew not whether it was a creature from native folklore or something else, but it didn't matter. It was here. Before I could take in any more detail, the creature began to laugh, a guttural sound that echoed in my head hauntingly. It was laughing so hard at me that it nearly doubled over. I realized that its limbs were able to wrap around its body almost twice. I raised my rifle, firing several times at it point blank, all of those rounds lodging firmly into the creature's neck and torso. The being looked down at its new piercings. Then, without a problem, almost comfortably, it began to dig out the bullets at an unhurried pace. It dropped them onto the ground like a child plucking flower petals, and it seemed to sigh in irritation as it dug out the final one. "Do you think your grandfather tried the same thing?" The voice that emerged from beneath the skull was deep and resonant, with an accent I couldn't place. Ancient and yet modern at the same time. He did, many times, until he realized there were better ways to survive. It just spoke. What was going on? What did this thing want? Did Grandpa always know about this horrendous-looking thing? My head began to ache with the strain of trying to understand all this. It seemed as though it was annoyed by the bullets. It then lifted its claw and pointed it at the cabin. "You don't belong here. This place has been claimed. Leave while you still have the option. Go," was all I could get out in reply to this thing speaking to me. I blinked profusely, and the next thing I knew, the monster was gone, and standing there was Bennett, my grandpa Joseph's best friend. Bennett had been around as long as I could remember and had always been a kind old man. He supposedly lived on the other side of the mountain, even though I'd never actually seen his house, let alone been to it. Bennett just always sort of appeared out of nowhere, often startling us so badly that we had almost shot him a few times. "What in tarnation you doing out here, whippersnapper?" "Am I dreaming?" I managed to stammer, still gripping the rifle, though I'd lowered it. "No, you're not dreaming. But you need to get inside before that thing comes back, that thing that looks like your granddaddy." I was shaking so tremendously from fear that I could barely move my limbs at the time. But I managed to navigate the steps. I'm not entirely sure why I obeyed Bennett after seeing that thing. But after seeing Bennett's familiar face, there was something calming about it, making this insane situation more easily dealt with. Once inside, Bennett bolted the door and drew all the curtains. He moved with a familiarity that suggested he'd been in the cabin many times before. Without asking, he went to a specific floorboard near the fireplace, pried it up, and pulled out a bottle of bourbon and 2 glasses. "Your granddaddy and I kept this for emergencies," he said, pouring generous amounts into both glasses. His hands were steady, but I noticed deep scars across his knuckles and forearms. "Drink. You need it." I downed the bourbon in one gulp, welcoming the burning sensation. What was that thing? And why did it look like my grandfather? Bennett sighed heavily, suddenly looking every one of his 70-something years. "That wasn't your grandfather. That thing. It takes forms that will affect you the most. Makes you hesitate. Makes you vulnerable. But what is it? Some folks around these parts have names for it. Old names, but names don't matter much when you're face to face with it." Bennett refilled my glass. "What matters is that it's been here a long time. Long before your grandfather bought this land. Long before anyone settled here. You've seen it before. Many times." Bennett rolled up his sleeve to reveal a twisted scar that ran from wrist to elbow. "Got this the first time, back in '82. Your grandfather saved my life that night." "Is that why he always had a shotgun by the door, even when we were just fishing?" Bennett nodded. "Joseph never took chances after our first encounter. He knew what was out there. But the newspapers said he was killed by a bear." A bitter laugh escaped Bennett's lips. "That's what the authorities put down. Easier that way. No one wants to admit there's something in these woods that can't be explained, can't be hunted, can't be stopped." I felt a cold dread settling in my stomach. If bullets don't work, how do you fight it? You don't. Bennett's eyes met mine, and I saw genuine fear there. You survive. You learn its patterns. You make accommodations. Accommodations? What does that mean? Bennett looked away. Your grandfather made a deal. That's why he was able to live here as long as he did. What kind of deal? But Bennett shook his head. That's not for me to say. Joseph took that to his grave. But I do know this. That thing out there, it's coming back. And it wants something from you now. I couldn't sleep that night. Bennett took the couch, his snores filling the cabin with a comforting human sound. I sat by the window, watching the woods, jumping at every shadow and sound. By morning, I was exhausted but determined to understand what was happening. Over a breakfast of strong coffee and bacon, Bennett told me what he knew about the history of the area. The land had belonged to a logging company in the 1950s, but operations had ceased after a series of unexplained accidents. Several workers had disappeared, others had suffered from delusions and violent outbursts. The company had eventually abandoned the site, selling off parcels to private buyers at ridiculously low prices. Your grandfather got this place for a song, Bennett said. He knew the stories, but he didn't believe them, not at first. When did he start believing? The summer of '79. That's when he first saw it. He was clearing land for the cabin, and it came to him at dusk, stood right where he was working and stared at him. He ran all the way to my place that night, white as a sheet, talking nonsense about a man with a deer's head. Bennett explained that over the years, they had researched similar sightings in the area, going back to the earliest settlers. Even the native tribes had stories about the mountain and warned against settling here. They spoke of a being that guarded the land that demanded respect and tribute. Your grandfather became obsessed with understanding it, Bennett continued. He collected every story, every account, spent years tracking its appearances, its behavior. And what did he learn? That it follows rules, has patterns. It's not random, not completely. There's a logic to it, even if it's not human logic. I thought about the claw marks, getting closer to the cabin each night. The animal bones arranged in patterns, the whispering that seemed to be trying to communicate something. You said my grandfather made a deal? What kind of deal could anyone make with something like that? Bennett's expression darkened. I don't know the specifics. Joseph stopped telling me everything after a while, but I know it involved sacrifices. Sacrifices? Like animals? At first, Bennett wouldn't meet my eyes. But things escalated over the years. Your grandfather changed, became secretive, started spending more and more time alone in the woods. A terrible thought occurred to me. Is that why he stopped inviting me up here? After that summer when I was 18? Bennett nodded slowly. He was protecting you. He told me once that he saw how that thing looked at you, like it was interested. I remembered the last hunting trip with my grandfather, how jumpy he'd been, how he'd insisted I stay inside after dark, the argument we'd had when I'd wanted to go night fishing at the lake. And then, the night before we were supposed to leave, I'd seen something watching us from the tree line. Something tall and thin with antlers, silhouetted against the moon. Grandfather had hustled me into the truck the next morning, barely giving me time to pack. We'd never spoken of it, and he'd never invited me back. What happens now? I asked. You have two choices, Bennett said. Leave and never come back. Sell the land to someone who doesn't know any better. Or what? Or you learn to live with it. Make your own arrangement. That night, Bennett left. He claimed he needed to get back to his own place before dark, but I suspected he didn't want to be at the cabin when night fell. Before he left, he pressed something into my hand, a small leather pouch filled with herbs and what looked like small bones. Keep this with you, he said. It won't stop it, but it might buy you some time if things go bad. Alone in the cabin, I considered my options. Leaving seemed the obvious choice. I could go back to the city, find a new apartment, a new job, start fresh. But something kept me rooted there. A combination of stubbornness, curiosity, and a strange sense that running wouldn't solve anything. That thing had been interested in me for a decade. Who was to say it wouldn't follow? As night fell, I prepared myself. I placed Bennett's pouch around my neck. I positioned myself in the center of the main room, away from windows and doors. And I waited. The scratching started just after midnight, gentle at first, almost tentative, at the back door. Then more insistent, moving to the windows, the walls, the roof. The whole cabin seemed to vibrate with the creature's presence. The temperature dropped dramatically, my breath fogging in the suddenly frigid air. And then the whispering started again. But this time I could understand the words. Grandson of Joseph, inheritor of debts. We have business, you and I. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, inside my head and all around me. I clutched Bennett's pouch, trying to steady my breathing. What do you want? I managed to say, my voice barely audible even to my own ears. The same thing I wanted from your grandfather. The same thing I've always wanted. And what's that? A low, rumbling laugh that made the floorboards vibrate. Acknowledgement, respect, tribute. What kind of tribute? The scratching stopped abruptly. In the sudden silence, I could hear my heart pounding. Come outside and we'll discuss terms. Every instinct screamed at me to stay inside, to keep the barriers between myself and that thing intact. But I knew somehow that this moment had been inevitable since I first inherited the cabin. Perhaps even before that. Perhaps since that night 10 years ago when it had first seen me. I moved to the door, my hand hovering over the knob. If I come out, we talk, nothing more, do you agree? Another laugh, softer this time. I agree to hear you. That is all I can promise. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. It was waiting for me, standing at the bottom of the steps. In the moonlight, it looked both more and less human than before. The deer skull seemed to float above the emaciated body, antlers reaching toward the stars like gnarled fingers. Its limbs were too long, joints bending in impossible directions. Joseph's blood, it said, the skull not moving but the voice clear in the night air. You have his stubbornness, his curiosity, his fear. What was your deal with my grandfather? Protection, for a price. What price? The creature tilted its head, an unnervingly human gesture on such an inhuman form. Animals at first, then secrets, then stories. Your grandfather was a wonderful storyteller. He would sit right where you're standing now and tell me tales of the world beyond these woods, of history and wars and human follies. In exchange, I kept other dangers away from his home. Other dangers? Like what? These woods harbor many threats: bears, mountain lions, men with darker intentions than mine. Your grandfather understood the value of my protection. I considered this. And when did the arrangement change? Bennett said things escalated. The creature's posture shifted, becoming more rigid. Your grandfather grew old, forgetful. He began to forget our arrangement, to wander into parts of the woods that were forbidden to him, to challenge boundaries we had established. So you killed him. I claimed what was owed to me, it corrected, voice hardening. As is my right. Fear gave way to anger, hot and sharp in my chest. He was my grandfather. He was a trespasser who violated our covenant. The creature took a step closer. But you are not bound by his mistakes. We can establish new terms, more favorable ones perhaps. What would you want from me? Company, it said simply. These woods are vast and empty. Eternity stretches long without conversation. That's all? Just talking to you? For now. Needs change with time. But yes, for now, your presence, your stories, your acknowledgement that this land is as much mine as it is yours. I thought about Bennett's warnings, about my grandfather's fate, about the claw marks getting closer to the door each night. And if I refuse? The creature's form seemed to blur at the edges, stretching taller, its antlers scraping the lowest branches of the nearby pines. Then you will find these woods most unwelcoming, and the barriers of your cabin most insufficient. I needed to make myself think through this logically, despite the fear making my thoughts scatter like leaves in a windstorm. The creature wanted company, stories, recognition. Was that really so terrible a price for safety? For the chance to stay in my new home? But I remembered Bennett's scars, my grandfather's fate, the creature's admission that needs change with time. Any deal I made now might evolve into something darker, more demanding, yet running seemed equally futile. This thing had fixated on me years ago, had perhaps been waiting for me to return, and it clearly had powers beyond my understanding. What was to stop it from following me if I fled? If I agree, I said slowly, there would be rules, boundaries, for both of us. The creature was motionless, but I sensed its attention sharpening. Speak your terms. You never enter the cabin without invitation. You never harm me or anyone who visits me. You protect the property from other threats, as you did for my grandfather. Acceptable. And in return, I took a deep breath. I'll talk with you. Share stories, news from beyond these woods. Acknowledge your connection to this land. Not enough, it said, voice rumbling like distant thunder. I require more tangible recognition. Like what? Offerings. Left at the edge of the woods each new moon. Nothing living, it added, seeing my expression. Food, trinkets, objects of interest from the world of men. It seemed a small price to pay for safety, for survival. Agreed. Then we have a covenant. The creature extended one long, clawed hand, sealed with a touch, as is tradition. Every fiber of my being revolted at the idea of touching that thing. But I forced myself forward, down the steps, until I stood before it. Slowly, I extended my hand. Its touch was not what I expected, not cold or scaly or rough, but warm and dry, like sun-baked stone. The moment our hands met, a jolt of something like electricity ran up my arm, and images flashed through my mind. The forest as it had been centuries ago, millennia ago, the rise and fall of civilizations, the creature standing unchanged through it all, watching, waiting. And then it was over. The creature released my hand and stepped back. The covenant is made, it said. Sleep without fear tonight, grandson of Joseph. We will speak again soon. It turned and moved toward the tree line, its form seeming to elongate and thin as it went, until it was indistinguishable from the shadows between the trees. I returned to the cabin, locked the door out of habit rather than necessity, and collapsed onto the couch. My hand still tingled where it had touched me, and my mind buzzed with the echoes of those ancient visions. I needed to make some decisions about this place, about how I would honor this strange arrangement while protecting myself from its potential evolution, about what I would tell Bennett or anyone else who asked why I chose to stay in a place with such a dark history. But those were concerns for tomorrow. Tonight, for the first time since arriving at the cabin, I fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, undisturbed by scratching or whispering or the weight of watching eyes. In the morning, I found a small, intricately carved wooden figure on the porch steps, a man with a deer's head, arms outstretched in what might have been a gesture of welcome or warning, a reminder of our covenant. I placed it on the mantel, where my grandfather had kept his most treasured possessions, where it would be visible to anyone who visited. A conversation piece, perhaps, a way to share the story of the cabin and its guardian without revealing too much. After all, who would believe me if I told the whole truth? Some stories are better left as mysteries, shared only with those who already understand the strangeness that lurks at the edges of our world. But sometimes, on nights when the moon is full and the forest is too quiet, I wonder if I made the right choice. If the price of staying will eventually grow too steep. If my grandfather tried to warn me, in his way, by keeping me away from this place after that long-ago summer. And sometimes, when I sit on the porch telling stories to the darkness, I imagine I see my grandfather's face behind that ivory skull, listening, waiting, judging my choices against his own. My right hand grips the worn leather steering wheel. My left arm rests on the open window, catching the cool Montana air. 20 years on these highways have etched the road maps into my skin like permanent ink. The name's Hank Cosgrove, former Army grunt turned long-haul trucker, and this is the story of how I drove straight into hell on an autumn night in 1998. Most people who've never done this job think trucking is boring. They don't understand that the monotony becomes a meditation, that the endless ribbon of asphalt becomes a confessional booth where a man faces his demons mile after lonely mile. I've hauled everything from baby formula to caskets across 48 states, weathered blizzards that turned the world white, and nursed my rig through desert heat that could fry an egg on the hood. But nothing prepared me for what happened on October 3rd, 1998. The job seemed routine. Farm equipment delivery to Absaroki, Montana, one of those dots on the map that most GPS systems don't even acknowledge. The dispatcher had warned me about construction on the main route, but assured me the detour was well marked. Like most things dispatchers tell you, this was a half-truth at best. I was making good time until about 4 in the afternoon when I hit the detour signs. Orange cones funneled me onto a narrow 2-lane road that twisted through dense pine forest. The GPS started going haywire, the automated voice stammering, recalculating every few minutes before finally giving up altogether. Classic technology, works fine until you actually need it. The October sun was already making its early retreat, casting long shadows across the road as I consulted my paper map. The trouble with backroads in Montana is they all look the same. Endless trees, occasional clearings, and not a landmark in sight that matches anything on a map. I'd been down plenty of roads like this before, but something about this one felt different, like the forest was watching me pass through. By 6 o'clock, dusk had settled in, and the temperature dropped sharply. I flicked on the high beams, illuminating a narrow tunnel through the pines. My rig's engine was the only sound for miles, a mechanical heartbeat in the wilderness. That's when I first noticed something wasn't right. The road signs had stopped appearing altogether. No mile markers, no town indicators, not even those little reflective arrows that warn about sharp curves. It was as if I'd slipped off the edge of the map into uncharted territory. I pulled into a small clearing to consult the map again and stretch my legs. The moment I killed the engine, the silence crashed down like a physical weight. No distant traffic, no airplanes overhead, not even the usual forest sounds, just a vacuum of noise that made my ears ring. 20 years on the road teaches you that silence like that isn't natural. The stars emerged overhead, brilliant and cold against the darkening sky. Montana's big sky country living up to its name, with constellations I normally couldn't see through city light pollution. I took a leak at the edge of the clearing, watching my breath cloud in the chilly air. That's when I heard it. the snap of a twig followed by the soft crunch of leaves. Not the random sounds of forest creatures, but the deliberate movement of something large trying to move quietly. "Hello?" My voice sounded thin in the vast silence. No response came, but I could feel eyes on me, watching from the tree line. I zipped up quickly and hustled back to the cab, locking the doors behind me, something I rarely did on rural routes. As the diesel engine rumbled back to life, I caught movement in my side mirror, just a shadow shifting among shadows, there and gone so quickly I might have imagined it. Back on the road, I tried the CB radio. "Breaker 19, this is Long Haul Hank. Anybody out there know how to get to Route 87 from the backcountry near Elkhorn Ridge?" "Over." Nothing but static answered me. 10 minutes later, headlights appeared in my rearview mirror. Not unusual in itself, other vehicles use these roads, but something about the timing made my neck prickle. The vehicle kept a consistent distance, not trying to pass despite the occasional straightaways where overtaking would have been possible. I squinted at the mirror, trying to make out the vehicle. A pickup truck, that much was clear from the height of the headlights. As it drew slightly closer on a curve, I could see it was an older model Ford, dark-colored, with a single occupant behind the wheel. Another 20 minutes passed with the Ford maintaining that same distance. Too close to be coincidence, too far to make out the driver. I took a random turn onto an even smaller road, hoping it would lead back to civilization, or at least confirm whether I was being followed. The Ford turned too. My palms began to sweat against the steering wheel. In 2 decades of trucking, I'd had my share of road rage incidents, parking lot confrontations, and late-night weirdos at truck stops, but this felt different. This felt like being hunted. I took another turn, then another, each road narrower than the last. The Ford stayed with me through every twist and turn like we were connected by an invisible tether. The CB radio suddenly crackled to life, startling me. Through the static, I caught fragments of a conversation between other truckers, normal chatter about way stations and traffic conditions. Never had ordinary trucker talk sounded so comforting. "Breaker 19, this is Long Haul Hank on back roads west of Absaroki. I've got a tail that won't quit. Anybody know if there's a gas station nearby?" "Over." After a long pause, a voice cut through the static. "Long Haul, this is Night Ride. There's a petro station about 10 miles ahead if you're on County Road 23. Can't miss it. Only lights for 20 miles. What kind of tail we talking about? Over." "Ford pickup, older model. Been following me for about an hour now. Probably nothing, but it's got my hackles up. Over." "Roger that, Hank. Probably just a local taking the same route. But if it makes you feel better, I'm heading that way myself. About 30 minutes out. Over." "Appreciate that, Night Ride. I'll check in when I hit the petro. Over and out." The promise of another trucker nearby and a gas station ahead eased my tension somewhat. The Ford was still there, maintaining that same eerie distance, neither closing in nor falling back. A few minutes later, I spotted a faint glow on the horizon, the fluorescent lights of the promised gas station cutting through the darkness. As I approached, I could see it wasn't a petro, as Night Ride had said, but some local place called Pine Ridge Gas and Grocery. It looked like it had been built in the 70s and not updated since, with 2 ancient pumps out front and a small convenience store with flickering lights. I pulled in under the harsh fluorescence, positioning my truck so I could keep an eye on the road. The Ford slowed as it approached, then turned into the station and parked away from the pumps, near the edge of the lot where the light barely reached. My throat went dry as I watched the driver's door. It remained closed, but I could feel someone watching me from behind the windshield. I climbed down from my cab, legs stiff from hours of driving, and headed for the store. As the door chimed above my head, I glanced back at the Ford one last time. The driver's side door was opening. The fluorescent lights inside the Pine Ridge Gas and Grocery buzzed like angry wasps, casting a sickly pallor over the dusty shelves. Behind the counter, a lanky kid with acne-scarred cheeks and dull eyes looked up from a dog-eared paperback. His name tag read, Todd. "Evening," he drawled, marking his place in the book. "Need fuel?" "Yeah, and some coffee if you've got it." I positioned myself so I could see through the windows to the Ford outside. The driver had emerged and was standing beside his vehicle, a tall figure in the shadows. Todd followed my gaze. "Something wrong, mister?" I considered lying, then thought better of it. "That truck's been following me for the last hour. Any chance you know who that is?" Todd squinted through the smudged windows. Can't see much from here. A lot of folks pass through, especially since they started that construction on the highway. He reached under the counter and produced a thermos. Coffee's on the house. You look like you could use it. The coffee was bitter and burnt, but the caffeine was welcome. I took my time filling up, watching as the man from the Ford finally started walking toward the store. In the harsh overhead lights of the fuel island, I got my first good look at him. He stood well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and a rangy build. His beard was unkempt, streaked with gray, and his eyes were deeply recessed under the brim of a filthy baseball cap. His clothes, flannel shirt, worn jeans, work boots, would have been unremarkable on any rural road in America. But there was something wrong about the way he carried himself. Too stiff, too deliberate, like someone trying to remember how to act human. When our eyes met, he didn't look away. Most people will break eye contact after a second or two. It's instinctual. This man stared without blinking, his eyes reflecting the fluorescent lights like a predator's in the dark. Todd shuffled out to check on me, chattering nervously about their world-famous coffee and asking about my route. I responded automatically, my attention fixed on the approaching stranger. "You know that guy?" I asked Todd, nodding toward the man. Todd glanced over, then quickly looked away. "Never seen him before." The kid's voice had changed, tightened. He was lying. "Why don't you head back inside?" I suggested. Todd didn't need to be told twice. He scurried back to the store, the door chiming as he disappeared inside. The man stopped a few yards away, just watching me. Up close, I could see dark stains on his clothing that might have been oil, or might have been something worse. "Evening," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "Can I help you with something?" He remained silent, head tilted slightly as if listening to something I couldn't hear. His eyes never left mine, but I had the distinct impression he was seeing something else entirely. After an uncomfortable silence, I screwed the gas cap back on and returned the nozzle to the pump. "Well, have a good night," I said, moving toward my truck. "You're lost." His voice was like gravel being crushed underfoot, rough and unsettling. I paused. "Just taking a detour. I know where I'm headed." A smile split his beard, revealing yellowed teeth. "No, you don't." Inside the store, Todd was on the phone, his back to the window. The man followed my gaze and his smile widened. "He won't help you. Nobody out here will." My hand instinctively went to my pocket where I kept my folding knife, a habit from my army days. "Look, friend, I don't want any trouble. I'm just passing through." "That's what they all say." He took a step closer. "But there's no passing through. Not anymore." I dealt with my share of roadside weirdos, but something about this man made my skin crawl. It wasn't just his words or his appearance. It was the absolute conviction in his eyes, like he was stating simple facts about the weather. I climbed into my cab and locked the door, starting the engine with shaking hands. Through the windshield, I watched the man return to his Ford without taking his eyes off me. No rush in his movements, just the steady confidence of a predator that knows its prey can't escape. As I pulled back onto the road, the CB radio crackled again. "Long haul, Hank, this is Night Ride. You at that station yet? Over." I grabbed the handset, relief flooding through me at the sound of another human voice. "Night Ride, this is Long Haul. Just leaving the station now. That Ford is still on me. Something's not right with the driver. Over." "What's your 20 exactly?" "Over." I hesitated. "That's the thing. I'm not sure anymore. Signs disappeared a while back. I'm on a 2-lane blacktop heading east from Pine Ridge Gas and Grocery. Over." Static hissed for several seconds before Night Ride's voice returned, softer now, almost hesitant. "Hank, there ain't no Pine Ridge Gas and Grocery on any map I know. Are you sure about that name?" Over. A cold weight settled in my stomach as I checked the rearview mirror. The Ford's headlights had appeared behind me, keeping that same measured distance. "Dead sure. Just stop there. Talk to a kid named Todd." Over. Another long pause. "Hank, listen careful. There was a Pine Ridge station about 15 years back, burned down after the owner, guy named Todd Mercer, went nuts and killed his family. You need to get back to the main highway. Now." Over. I nearly dropped the handset. "What are you saying? I just talked to this kid 5 minutes ago." But only static answered me. The CB had gone dead, the channel empty of all traffic like someone had thrown a switch. In the growing darkness, the Ford's headlights seemed to burn brighter, growing larger in my mirrors. I pressed the accelerator, pushing my rig harder than was safe on these winding roads. The speedometer crept up, 55, 60, 65, the trailer swaying dangerously behind me on the curves. The road stretched ahead, an endless black ribbon through the pines. I tried the CB again, cycling through all channels, but found nothing but static. My cell phone showed no service, not that I expected any out here. After 20 minutes of hard driving, I spotted a crossroads ahead with an actual street sign, the first I'd seen in hours. I slowed just enough to make the turn, hoping to lose my pursuer, or at least find my way back to civilization. The Ford's headlights disappeared from my mirrors, and for a moment, I thought I'd lost him. Then I rounded a bend and nearly drove off the road in shock. The Ford was there, parked across the road, blocking my path. The man stood in front of it, shotgun raised to his shoulder, aimed directly at my windshield. I slammed on the brakes, the trailer jackknifing slightly behind me. There was nowhere to go. Dense forest pressed in on both sides, too tight to maneuver an 18-wheeler through. The man approached, shotgun steady, his face now hidden in shadow. "Get out," he barked, his voice carrying clearly through the night air. My options were limited. I could try to run him down, but a shotgun blast through the windshield would end that plan quickly. I could try to reverse, but the jackknife trailer made that impossible without taking time to straighten out. Time he wouldn't give me. Slowly, I shut off the engine and raised my hands. "Take it easy, buddy. No need for that. Keys, now." He gestured with the shotgun. I tossed the keys onto the ground at his feet. He scooped them up without taking his eyes or his aim off me, then motioned for me to exit the truck. As I climbed down, the cold night air hit me like a physical blow. We were miles from anywhere, with no witnesses and no help coming. Whatever this man wanted, I was on my own. He circled around me, keeping the shotgun leveled at my chest, and began searching through my cab. After a few minutes, he emerged with my logbook and the shipping manifest. "Absaroki," he read aloud, his voice flat. "You're making a delivery to Absaroki." "That's right," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Farm equipment. They're expecting it tomorrow." He laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "No, they're not." He tossed the papers aside. "Nobody's expecting anything in Absaroki. Not anymore." "What do you want?" I asked, struggling to understand what was happening. "If it's money." "I want you to understand." He cut me off. "I want you to know what happens to people who take the wrong turn." He gestured toward the woods with the shotgun. "Start walking." "Look, if this is about territory or something, I'm just passing through. I don't even know where I am exactly." His eyes narrowed. "You're exactly where you're supposed to be. Now walk." With the shotgun at my back, I had no choice. I started into the forest, the darkness swallowing me as we moved away from the headlights. The man followed closely, the barrel of the shotgun occasionally prodding between my shoulder blades when I slowed. We walked for what felt like an hour, the forest growing denser, the night darker. Finally, we emerged into another clearing, and what I saw there froze the blood in my veins. Trucks, dozens of them. Abandoned 18-wheelers lined up in neat rows, some new, some so old they were more rust than metal. In the moonlight, I could make out different company logos, different states of decay. Some looked like they'd been there for decades. "What is this place?" I whispered, though I already knew the answer on some primal level. The man's voice came from just behind my ear, his breath hot on my neck. "It's where lost drivers end up. Welcome to Absaroki, Hank. Your final delivery. They say when you're about to die, your life flashes before your eyes. That's bullshit. What flashes before your eyes are all the mistakes that led you to that moment, the wrong turns, the bad decisions, the moments you should have trusted your gut but didn't." Standing in that clearing of abandoned trucks, I saw my mistake clearly. I should have turned around the moment I hit that detour. I should have ignored the dispatcher and taken the longer route. I should have trusted the unease that had been crawling up my spine since sunset. But those realizations were worthless now. "Move," the man ordered, shoving me toward the nearest truck, an ancient Peterbilt with 70s styling and Minnesota plates so rusted I could barely make out the numbers. As we got closer, I noticed something that made my stomach lurch. There was a dark stain on the driver's side door, spreading down from the window like something had leaked from inside. It looked horribly like dried blood. "Open it," he commanded, gesturing with the shotgun. My hands trembled as I reached for the door handle. It was stiff with disuse, but gave way with a protesting groan of metal. The smell hit me immediately, the unmistakable copper-sweet stench of old blood and decay. The cab's interior was dark, but the moonlight revealed enough. The seat and steering wheel were covered in dark stains, and something that might once have been human slumped against the passenger door, now little more than leathery skin stretched over bone. I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat. Jesus Christ! The man caught me by the collar, spinning me around to face the field of trucks. Every driver who takes the wrong turn ends up here. Some try to run, some try to fight. His grip tightened. It doesn't matter what they do. This is where the road ends for all of them. My mind raced, desperately searching for a way out. If I could just get back to my truck, I might have a chance. "Why?" I managed to ask. "Why are you doing this?" He tilted his head, studying me like I was a curious insect. "I'm not doing anything. The road chooses who stays and who goes. I'm just the caretaker." "Caretaker of what? A graveyard of trucks?" The words seemed to amuse him. "More than trucks die here, Hank. This place has been hungry for a long time. It takes the drivers, the cargo, even the memory of them from the world outside." He swept his arm in a wide gesture. "Notice anything about these trucks? No search parties, no police tape? Once you're here, it's like you never existed anywhere else." A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the night air. I thought about Night Ride on the CB and his warning about the gas station that had burned down 15 years ago. About Todd, the attendant who couldn't possibly be real. The man seemed to read my thoughts. "Starting to understand now, aren't you? The detour wasn't on any map. The gas station doesn't exist. Even Absaroki isn't a real place, not anymore." "That's impossible," I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew they were hollow. I'd been driving these roads for 20 years, and I'd never heard of Absaroki until this job came up. "Check your manifest again," he suggested with a knowing smile. "Look at the delivery address." I thought back to the paperwork I'd glanced at days ago when taking the job. Had there even been a street address? I couldn't remember seeing one, just the town name and a loading dock number. While my mind grappled with this, I noticed something the man had apparently forgotten. He'd lowered the shotgun slightly as he talked, the barrel now pointing at the ground rather than my chest. 20 years ago in the Army, they'd trained us for moments like this. How to disarm an opponent. How to create an opening. How to survive. The training was rusty, but it was still there, buried under 2 decades of civilian life. I lunged forward without warning, driving my shoulder into his midsection while grabbing for the shotgun. He was stronger than he looked, and his finger tightened on the trigger as we struggled. The blast tore through the night, the shot going wide into the trees. We fell to the ground, rolling in the dirt, both fighting for control of the weapon, his face contorted with rage, all pretense of calm disappearing. "You can't leave," he snarled, spittle flying from his lips. "Nobody leaves." I smashed my forehead into his nose, feeling it crunch beneath the impact. Blood sprayed, black in the moonlight, but his grip on the shotgun didn't loosen. He brought his knee up into my groin, and pain exploded through my body, momentarily paralyzing me. He used the advantage to roll on top, pinning me with his weight while raising the shotgun like a club. I got my arm up just in time to block the blow, the stock glancing off my forearm instead of crushing my skull. The pain was immediate and intense. The bone might be fractured, but at least I was still conscious. I drove my other fist into his throat, a desperate move that connected solidly. He gagged, his grip on the shotgun faltering for just an instant. It was enough. I wrenched the weapon from his hands and scrambled away, putting distance between us as I rose to my feet. He recovered quickly, pulling a long hunting knife from his belt. "Do you think you're the first to fight back?" he wheezed, his damaged throat affecting his speech. "They all try something. It never works." I had the shotgun now, but I'd never been comfortable with firearms even during my service. Still, the solid weight of it in my hands gave me courage. "Stay back," I warned, raising it to my shoulder. He laughed that broken glass laugh again. Go ahead. Pull the trigger. See what happens. Something in his confidence made me hesitate. I ejected the shell and checked the chamber, empty. I pumped it again, and another spent shell ejected. The gun was fully unloaded except for the round he'd fired during our struggle. His grin widened. Like I said, I'm just the caretaker. I don't need weapons to keep you here. I threw the useless shotgun aside and backed away, looking for anything I could use as a weapon or a path of escape. The clearing was surrounded by dense forest on all sides except for the narrow track we'd come in on. Then I heard it, the sound of an engine starting. One of the trucks in the clearing, a newer model Kenworth, rumbled to life, its headlights cutting through the darkness. No one was in the cab. Another engine started, then another. Around the clearing, trucks began awakening, their lights illuminating, diesel engines growling like hungry beasts. The man stood calmly in the middle of it all, watching me with those unblinking eyes. You see, he said softly, barely audible over the engines, this place has its own rules, its own hunger. I ran. Blind panic drove me into the trees, away from the clearing and its impossible horrors. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me, but I kept moving. Behind me I heard the man's laughter, and worse, the sound of multiple engines revving, of massive tires beginning to roll. They were coming after me. The empty trucks were hunting me through the forest. I crashed through the underbrush, my lungs burning, my fractured arm throbbing with each heartbeat. The forest seemed to close in around me, branches reaching like grasping fingers, roots rising to snare my feet. Through the trees, I caught glimpses of headlights moving in impossible ways, weaving between trunks too narrow for any vehicle to pass. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I broke through the tree line and found myself back on the road. My road, where this nightmare had begun. In the distance I could see my truck, still jackknifed across the pavement, its hazard lights blinking steadily in the night. Hope surged through me. If I could reach it, start it somehow without the keys, maybe I could escape this place. I sprinted down the road, each footfall bringing me closer to salvation. Behind me, the forest seemed to exhale, a collective sigh of branches and leaves that sent a cold wave of air across my back. The sound of engines grew louder, and I risked a glance over my shoulder. They were emerging from the trees, not just the man's Ford, but 3 of the trucks from the clearing, ghostly drivers visible behind their windshields, their faces hollow and rotted like the corpse I'd seen earlier. I ran harder than I'd ever run in my life, my focus narrowed to the singular goal of reaching my truck. 50 yards. 40, 30. The distance collapsed under my desperate sprint. When I reached the cab, I nearly sobbed with relief. Climbing up, I tried the door, locked, of course. I smashed my elbow through the side window, ignoring the glass that sliced into my skin, and reached through to unlock it from the inside. The pursuing vehicles were closing in, their headlights illuminating the interior of my cab as I frantically searched for any way to start the engine without keys. In the Army, I'd learned how to hotwire certain military vehicles, but a modern semi was another matter entirely. As I tore at the steering column, my hand brushed against something in the cup holder, a spare key. I'd forgotten I kept one hidden for emergencies, a habit I'd picked up years ago after locking myself out at a rest stop in Nevada. With shaking hands, I jammed the key into the ignition and turned. The engine roared to life, and I slammed the truck into gear, maneuvering to straighten out the trailer. In my side mirrors, I could see the Ford and the ghostly trucks bearing down on me, now only yards away. The trailer finally straightened, and I floored the accelerator. The truck lurched forward, slowly at first, then with gathering speed. The pursuing vehicles gained on me, the Ford pulling alongside my trailer. Through the passenger window, I could see the man keeping pace, his eyes locked on mine, his mouth moving as if speaking words I couldn't hear. Then he swerved sharply, his Ford slamming into the side of my cab. The impact nearly sent me off the road, but I held the wheel steady and maintained course. He fell back slightly, then accelerated again, clearly planning another ram. Behind him, the ghostly trucks were gaining, their rotting drivers leaning forward with anticipation. I pushed my rig to its limits, the engine screaming in protest as we thundered down the dark road. The Ford tried to pull alongside again, but this time I was ready. As he swerved toward me, I jerked the wheel in the opposite direction, then sharply back, using the trailer's momentum to slam into his smaller vehicle. The Ford spun out, careening into the ditch beside the road. In my mirrors, I saw it roll once, twice, before coming to rest on its roof, headlights still burning but pointing uselessly at the sky. The ghostly truck slowed as they approached the wrecked Ford, circling it like wary predators. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I kept driving, pushing my rig harder than was safe, desperate to put distance between myself and that cursed place. For hours, I drove without stopping, taking every turn that seemed to lead toward civilization, away from the depths of the forest. The CB remained dead, my cell phone useless, and the few road signs I encountered seemed to contradict each other, as if the geography itself was shifting around me. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, I finally saw something that made my heart leap, a highway sign indicating Interstate 90 was ahead. I'd found my way back to the main road, back to the world I knew. But as I approached the intersection, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. The light looked strange, too golden, too perfect. The air had a stillness that didn't belong to the natural world. And then I saw it. The Pine Ridge Gas and Grocery, looking exactly as it had hours before, its fluorescent light still flickering in the early morning light. Parked out front was a familiar Ford pickup, and leaning against the pump was the man, watching my approach with that same unblinking stare. I slammed on the brakes, the trailer fishtailing behind me. This was impossible. I'd seen the Ford crash. I'd driven for hours in the opposite direction. The man pushed off from the pump and began walking toward me, his movements unnaturally smooth. Behind him, the door to the gas station opened, and Todd stepped out, his face expressionless. I threw the truck into reverse, backing away from this impossible scene, then swung the wheel hard, executing a frantic three-point turn in the middle of the road. As I accelerated away, I glanced in my mirrors. The gas station was gone. The road behind me was empty. But in the tree line beside the road, I could see him standing perfectly still, watching me drive away. Dawn painted the sky in shades of fire as I drove, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, my eyes constantly checking the mirrors for any sign of pursuit. The fracture in my arm had swollen to twice its normal size, throbbing with each heartbeat. Glass cuts on my hands and face had crusted over with dried blood, and every muscle in my body screamed from the night's exertions. But I was alive. I was moving, and the road ahead seemed to be leading somewhere real. After another hour of driving, I crested a hill and saw a familiar sight, the interstate stretching across the landscape like a lifeline. Traffic moved along it, normal morning commuters and commercial vehicles going about their business, unaware of the nightmare that existed just miles away in the backwoods. I merged onto the highway, the solid feel of well-maintained asphalt beneath my tires bringing a rush of relief so intense I nearly wept. My CB radio suddenly crackled to life, filled with the normal chatter of truckers discussing routes and weather conditions. My cell phone chimed with a series of delayed text messages, signal bars finally appearing on the screen. I was back in the world. But was I safe? The question haunted me as I pulled into the first truck stop I found, a bustling pilot with a crowded parking lot and a restaurant full of drivers hunched over plates of eggs and coffee. Normal, mundane, real. I parked and sat for a long moment, gathering my courage to step out of the cab. What if this was another illusion? What if I opened the door and found myself back in that clearing of abandoned trucks, the man waiting for me with his knowing smile? Eventually, necessity forced me to move. My arm needed medical attention, and I needed to contact my dispatcher to explain why I'd missed my delivery window. I climbed down carefully, half expecting the world to shift around me, but everything remained solid and ordinary. Inside the truck stop, I approached the counter and asked the cashier where I was exactly. "Billings," she said, giving me an odd look. "You okay, mister? You look like you've been through the ringer." "Accident," I explained vaguely. "Is there a hospital nearby?" She gave me directions to the nearest emergency room, her concern evident as she took in my battered appearance. "Want me to call someone for you? Police or anything?" I shook my head. "Just need to make a few calls myself. Thanks." At a quiet booth in the corner of the restaurant, I dialed my dispatcher, Frank, dreading the conversation. Frank was a good guy, but he ran a tight ship and didn't tolerate missed deliveries. "Hank?" He sounded surprised to hear from me. "Where the hell have you been? I've been trying to reach you since yesterday afternoon." "Had some trouble on the detour route," I said, keeping it simple. "Got lost, then had an accident. I'm in Billings now, headed to the hospital to get checked out." Frank's tone softened slightly. "How bad is it? You okay to drive?" "Might have a broken arm. Truck's banged up but operational." "Look, Frank, about that delivery to Absaroki." "To where?" Frank interrupted. My blood ran cold. "Absaroki, the farm equipment delivery." When he didn't respond, I added, "Check the manifest. Job number 1998-273. I heard keyboard clicking on his end, then a long pause. "Hank, there's no delivery with that job number, and there's definitely no place called Absaroki on any of our routes." My free hand gripped the edge of the table, knuckles whitening. "Frank, I have the paperwork right here. I've been hauling this load for 3 days." "What load?" His confusion sounded genuine. "According to my system, your truck is empty. You were deadheading back from Seattle after dropping off that lumber shipment. No pickup scheduled until tomorrow in Fargo." I opened my mouth to argue, then closed it. Slowly, I set down the phone and walked back to my truck on unsteady legs. Opening the trailer doors, I found exactly what Frank had described. An empty cargo area, swept clean, with no sign of the farm equipment I'd been hauling. Back in the restaurant, I picked up the phone where Frank was still asking questions. "I need some time off," I said, cutting him short. "Family emergency. I'll call you in a few days." Before he could respond, I hung up and dialed another number, my old Army buddy Mike, who now worked as a county records clerk in Montana. "Mike, it's Hank Cosgrove. I need a favor. Can you check if there's ever been a town called Absaroki in Montana? Or a gas station called Pine Ridge anywhere in the state?" Mike didn't ask why I needed to know, which was one of the reasons we'd stayed friends for 20 years. He just went quiet for a few minutes, then came back on the line. "No town by that name in any records, current or historical," he said. "As for Pine Ridge Gas and Grocery, there was one about 15 miles east of Elkhorn. Burned down in '83 after the owner killed himself and his kid. Pretty grisly story, actually. They say—" "Did the kid's name happen to be Todd?" I interrupted. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds. "Yeah, how'd you know that?" I thanked him and hung up, my mind reeling. It was true. All of it. The gas station that shouldn't exist. The town that wasn't real. The manifest that had disappeared from both my trailer and Frank's records. At the hospital, I gave the doctors a simplified version of events. I'd been run off the road, fought with my attacker, and managed to escape. They set my fractured ulna, stitched up the deeper cuts, and prescribed painkillers that barely touched the edges of my fear. When they asked if I wanted to file a police report, I declined. What would I tell them? That I'd been hunted by a man who might not be human, on roads that didn't exist, delivering cargo to a town that had never been real? Instead, I checked into a motel on the outskirts of Billings, a shabby place that asked no questions when I paid cash for a week's stay. I needed time to think, to recover, to make sense of what had happened. The first night, exhaustion pulled me into a deep sleep despite my fear. I dreamed of the clearing and its field of abandoned trucks, but in the dream I was looking out from behind the wheel of one of them, unable to move, watching as new victims were brought before me. I woke gasping, sheets soaked with sweat, the motel room spinning around me. For a disorienting moment, I thought I was back in my truck, still trapped on those endless back roads. The red glow of the alarm clock read 3:17 a.m., the dead hours of the night when the barrier between worlds feels thinnest. Something scratched at my door, a soft, persistent noise that might have been branches in the wind, except there were no trees near my room. I lay perfectly still, listening as the scratching moved from the door to the window, fingernails on glass, testing, seeking entry. "I know you're awake, Hank," a familiar voice called from outside, gravel rough and mocking. "You can't hide here. The road always finds a way back to you." I fumbled for the bedside lamp, clicking it on. The scratching stopped immediately. When I gathered my courage to peer through the curtains, the parking lot was empty except for my truck and a few other vehicles belonging to guests. But my truck was different. Even from the window, I could see that its color had changed slightly. Darker, more like the Ford that had pursued me. And something was written in the dust on the driver's side door. Not over. I didn't sleep again that night. At first light, I checked out of the motel and hit the road, heading east toward the Dakotas, putting distance between myself and Montana. I told myself it was over, that I'd escaped whatever trap had been set for me in those backwoods. The miles rolled by, the landscape changing from mountains to plains, and gradually my breathing slowed. The truck ran smoothly, the radio played normal songs, and the sky above was an ordinary, comforting blue. Other vehicles passed me or fell behind, their drivers giving me casual waves of acknowledgement. By nightfall, I'd crossed into South Dakota and found another motel, this one part of a national chain, brightly lit and busy with tourists. I slept without dreams, and when morning came, no messages waited for me in the dust on my truck. For 3 days, I drove without incident, zigzagging across the upper Midwest, taking main highways and avoiding backroads entirely. I called Frank and spun a story about a family illness that had cleared up sooner than expected, and he assigned me a simple load from Minneapolis to Chicago. The routine of the job began to settle over me again, the familiar rhythm of driving, the camaraderie of truck stops, the predictable challenges of traffic and weather. I began to think that maybe, just maybe, I had put Absaroki behind me for good. Then came the CB call that shattered my fragile peace. Breaker 19 for long haul Hank. Come in, Hank. Over. I froze, the handset halfway to my lips. No one had called me long haul in days, not since. Long haul Hank, this is Night Ride. Remember me? Over. Night Ride. The trucker who had warned me about the gas station, the one who had disappeared from the CB when I needed him most. Against my better judgment, I keyed the mic. Night Ride, this is Hank. I remember you. Over. Glad you made it out, Hank. Not many do. Over. A chill ran through me. What do you know about that place? Over. Static filled the channel for a long moment before his voice returned. I know it's been taking drivers for decades. I know it makes people forget those it takes. And I know it's not finished with you yet. Over. How do you know all this? Over. Another pause, longer this time. Because I've been running from it for 30 years, Hank, just like you're going to do now. It let you go for a reason. It's playing with you. Over. I glanced in my mirrors, suddenly aware of how empty the highway had become in the last few minutes. No cars behind me, none ahead, just an open road stretching to the horizon. What do I do? Over. Keep moving. Stay on main roads. Never drive at night if you can help it. And whatever you do, don't pick up hitchhikers, especially not ones who look like people you've seen before. Over. Before I could ask anything else, a truck appeared in my mirror. An old Peterbilt, similar to the one I'd seen in the clearing. It was gaining on me rapidly, its headlights too bright, too focused. Night Ride, there's a truck coming up fast behind me. Over. Nothing but static answered me. The CB had gone dead again. The Peterbilt was now right on my tail, close enough that I couldn't see its grill in my mirrors, just those blinding headlights. I accelerated, pushing well above the speed limit, but it matched my pace effortlessly. After several tense minutes, it suddenly swung out and passed me on the left. As it drew alongside, I got a clear view of the driver, a rotting corpse in a flannel shirt, its leathery face split in a grin that revealed blackened teeth. It raised one skeletal hand in a mocking wave. I blinked, and the driver transformed into the bearded man from the gas station, still grinning, still waving. Then the Peterbilt pulled ahead and disappeared around a bend in the road. When I rounded the same bend seconds later, the truck was gone. The highway stretched empty before me, but something had changed. The landscape was wrong, too wild, too empty. The vegetation shifting from Midwestern prairie to dense Montana pine forest. A road sign appeared ahead, Absaroki 50 miles. My hands tightened on the wheel as understanding dawned. It didn't matter how far I ran or what roads I took. Some part of me had never left that place, and now it was pulling me back, reeling me in like a fish on a line. The road narrowed, the pavement growing rough beneath my tires. The sky darkened unnaturally fast, stars appearing in a pattern I recognized from that first night in the clearing. In my rearview mirror, headlights appeared, not just one pair, but dozens, a convoy of the damned coming to welcome me back. And ahead, just visible in the gathering gloom, was the flickering sign of the Pine Ridge Gas and Grocery. As I approached, I could see two figures waiting by the pumps, Todd, forever young, and the bearded man, forever patient. They watched my truck draw near, neither moving nor speaking, secure in the knowledge that I had nowhere else to go. I had one chance. One desperate, probably futile chance to break the cycle. Instead of slowing down, I pressed the accelerator to the floor. My truck roared in response, picking up speed as I aimed directly at the gas station. The bearded man's smile faltered for the first time as he realized my intention. He stepped forward, raising his hands as if to stop 18 tons of steel through sheer will. I closed my eyes as the impact came. They found my truck 3 days later, wrapped around a tree just off Interstate 90 near Sheridan, Wyoming. According to the accident report, I'd fallen asleep at the wheel and drifted off the road at nearly 80 miles per hour. The cab was crushed beyond recognition. The trailer split open like a tin can, spilling its contents across the forest floor. The contents that weren't supposed to exist, farm equipment bound for a town that wasn't real. By all rights, I should have died in that crash. The highway patrol officers who extracted me from the wreckage called it a miracle that I survived with only a concussion, 4 broken ribs, and a punctured lung. They said I'd been unconscious for nearly 72 hours, mumbling incoherently about trucks and roads that led nowhere. But I knew the truth. It wasn't luck that saved me. It was something much worse. I spent 3 weeks in the hospital, reconstructing my memories piece by piece. Some came back clean and sharp: the gas station, the man with the shotgun, the clearing full of abandoned trucks. Others remained hazy, dreamlike, as if my mind was trying to protect me from the full horror of what I'd experienced. The doctors talked about traumatic brain injury and post-concussion syndrome. They nodded sympathetically when I tried to explain about Absaroki and the bearded man, writing it off as confusion resulting from my injuries. No one mentioned the fact that my empty trailer had been full of cargo that shouldn't have existed. Frank visited me once, awkward and concerned. He spoke about insurance claims and disability benefits, carefully avoiding any mention of where I'd been or what I'd been hauling. When I pressed him about the delivery to Absaroki, he changed the subject, his eyes skittering away from mine like he was afraid of what he might see there. I was released on a Tuesday, a brisk autumn day with leaves skittering across the hospital parking lot. My brother Dave had flown in from Arizona to drive me back to my apartment in Idaho. We made small talk on the long drive, his kids, his job, the weather, neither of us mentioning the elephant in the room, until we hit the Montana border. "We could go around," Dave said suddenly, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Take the southern route through Wyoming. Add a few hours, but—" He trailed off, unable to articulate why we should avoid the direct route, but I understood. He'd been having dreams too. Dreams about backroads and gas stations that shouldn't exist. Dreams about his brother disappearing into the dark. "It's okay," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Let's stick to the interstate. It'll be fine." Dave nodded, but I noticed he checked the mirrors more frequently after that, his eyes darting nervously to each exit sign we passed. When night fell, he insisted on stopping at a well-lit chain hotel just off the highway, though we could have pushed on for several more hours. In my room that night, I stood at the window, watching the traffic flow past on the interstate. Each set of headlights a reminder of the convoy that had pursued me through the darkness. In the parking lot below, our rental car sat undisturbed, ordinary and unremarkable. Unlike my truck, which remained impounded at a salvage yard near the crash site, too damaged to repair but too valuable to scrap entirely. I'd arranged to have my personal belongings retrieved, but something held me back from claiming them. Some instinct warned me that those items, my logbook, my thermos, my dog-eared road atlas, might have been changed by their proximity to what happened. Then again, maybe I was the one who had changed. Dave and I completed the journey without incident, sticking to main roads, driving only during daylight hours. My apartment welcomed me back with the stale air and accumulated dust of a place long uninhabited. Dave helped me settle in, stocked my fridge, and reluctantly returned to his own life after extracting numerous promises that I would call if I needed anything. For weeks, I barely left my apartment. My injuries provided a convenient excuse, but the truth was simpler. I was afraid. Afraid of roads and highways, afraid of the rumble of diesel engines, afraid of what might be waiting for me in the dark spaces between destinations. When the nightmares came, they followed a pattern. I would be driving, always driving, down endless back roads that twisted in impossible ways. Sometimes I was pursued, sometimes I was the pursuer. Sometimes I was the man with the shotgun, leading other drivers into the clearing of abandoned trucks. And always, I woke gasping at precisely 3:17 a.m., the moment when the barrier between worlds was thinnest. After 2 months of recovery, my savings had dwindled to nearly nothing. The insurance settlement from the accident covered my medical bills, but little else. I needed to work, but the thought of climbing back into a truck's cab made my hands shake and my heart race. I found a job at a local warehouse, loading and unloading the very trucks I used to drive. The irony wasn't lost on me, but at least it kept me in one place, with no expectations of venturing onto the open road. It was there, on a bitter December morning, that I saw him again. The bearded man from the gas station. He was driving one of the delivery trucks, his face partially hidden by that same dirty baseball cap. But I would have recognized him anywhere. Our eyes met across the loading dock, and he smiled that knowing smile before pulling away, his truck disappearing into the morning traffic. I quit that afternoon. My next job was at a call center, as far removed from transportation as I could get. I worked nights, partly because the pay was better, partly because it meant I was awake during those vulnerable hours when the nightmares were strongest. For nearly a year, I maintained this nocturnal existence, slowly rebuilding my life within carefully constructed boundaries. I avoided highways. I never drove after dark. I took taxis rather than buses when possible. And gradually, the nightmares began to fade, appearing only occasionally rather than nightly. I might have convinced myself it was over, if not for the postcards. The first arrived on the anniversary of the accident, a generic tourist card showing Pine Ridge National Forest. No message, no return address, postmarked from a town I'd never heard of in western Montana. The second came a month later, another forest scene, this one featuring an empty clearing surrounded by pines. Similar to the one where I'd seen the abandoned trucks, but not quite the same. This card had a message. Still keeping your spot warm. T. Todd. The gas station attendant who shouldn't have existed. The boy who had died in 1983. The postcards continued arriving at irregular intervals, each featuring locations increasingly familiar to me. A gas station similar to Pine Ridge, a stretch of highway that resembled the one where I'd crashed, a truck stop where the patrons all had their backs to the camera, their faces hidden. I kept them in a shoebox under my bed, unable to throw them away, yet unwilling to look at them for long. Each new arrival set my recovery back weeks, plunging me into paranoia and insomnia. After the sixth postcard, this one showing my apartment building with a red X marked over my window, I decided I couldn't stay. I packed a single bag, emptied my bank account, and left Idaho without telling anyone where I was going. I drifted for months, taking odd jobs in small towns across the Northwest, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots or receive mail. I avoided truck stops and highways, taking meandering local routes between destinations, always vigilant for signs that I was being followed. It was during this nomadic period that I began researching similar incidents. Disappearances along remote highways, truckers who vanished mid-route only to reappear days or weeks later with no memory of where they'd been, reports of ghost towns that appeared on no maps but were occasionally encountered by lost travelers. The patterns were too consistent to be coincidence. The backroads of America were haunted by places like Absaroki, phantom locations that existed in the cracks between reality, trapping unwary travelers, and sometimes, rarely, releasing them changed. I started keeping a journal, documenting my experiences and the stories I gathered. At first, it was therapeutic, a way to organize my thoughts and convince myself I wasn't crazy. Later, it became something more, a warning, a map, a guide for others who might find themselves on roads that lead nowhere. In a small library in northern Washington, I met Karen, a local historian researching disappearances along the old logging roads. We compared notes, finding disturbing similarities between my experience and the cases she'd documented dating back to the 1920s. It's like there are thin spots, she explained, spreading a map across the table between us. Places where the normal world and something else brush against each other. Most are temporary, appearing and disappearing at random, but some are permanent, anchored to locations with violent histories. Like the Pine Ridge Gas and Grocery, I suggested. She nodded. Exactly. A murder-suicide creates a wound in reality. Over time, that wound festers, drawing in similar energies, similar tragedies. She tapped a section of the map where several disappearances had been marked. This whole region is a hotspot. Something about the geography, maybe, or the history. What about the people? I asked. The ones who stay there, like the man with the shotgun? Or Todd? Karen hesitated, her finger tracing circles on the map. I think they're caught between worlds. Not fully there, not fully here. Guardians or prisoners, maybe both. And the trucks? The ones that drove themselves? Echoes, she said softly. Residual energy from the vehicles and their drivers replaying the moment of crossing over. Like ghosts, but with more purpose. It made as much sense as anything else I'd considered. We spent weeks correlating her historical research with my first-hand experience, creating a comprehensive theory of what I'd encountered. Academic paper. I refused. Publicizing the existence of places like Absaroki would only draw more people to them, creating more victims, more echoes, more thin spots between worlds. Instead, I did something riskier. I went back. Not to Montana specifically, but to the road. I bought a used pickup, not a Ford, and began retracing the routes where disappearances had occurred, looking for patterns, for warnings, for ways to identify thin spots before they could trap the unwary. I never drove at night. I avoided unmarked detours. I carried specialized equipment, electromagnetic field detectors, thermometers, barometers, to measure environmental changes that might indicate a crossing point. And I documented everything, building on the journal I'd started months earlier. For 2 years, I traveled this way, a ghost hunter of sorts. Though the ghosts I sought were places rather than people, I found dozens of thin spots across the Northwest, marking them on my maps, warning locals when possible, sometimes intervening directly when I saw travelers about to take dangerous turns. The postcards stopped coming, whether because I was mobile or because whatever sent them had lost interest, I couldn't say. The nightmares continued, but less frequently, and I learned to manage them with meditation techniques Karen had taught me. I was in eastern Oregon when I found it again. Not Absaroki itself, but another place like it. A small gas station on a forgotten highway, with a single attendant whose eyes reflected the light wrongly. I drove past without stopping, noting its location in my journal, warning the next town about the dangerous road conditions in that area. That night, in a motel 50 miles away, I woke at exactly 3:17 a.m. Outside my window, an old Ford pickup was idling, its engine a low growl in the pre-dawn darkness. The bearded man leaned against its hood, smoking a cigarette, his eyes fixed on my window. Our gazes met across the parking lot, and he raised his hand in that mocking wave I remembered so well. Then he climbed into the Ford and drove away, his taillights disappearing around a corner. I checked out immediately, driving east until the sun rose, putting as much distance as possible between myself and that place. But I knew the truth now. I would never truly escape. The road had marked me, claimed me in some fundamental way. I could run for the rest of my life, but part of me would always be back in that clearing, among the abandoned trucks and their ghostly drivers. This is where my story stands today. I'm still traveling, still mapping, still warning those who will listen. The journal has grown into a manuscript, this manuscript, which I've duplicated and left copies of in selected locations across the country, hoping they'll reach the right people. If you're reading this, you might be one of those people. Maybe you're a trucker who's noticed strange patterns on your regular routes. Maybe you're a traveler who's had your own brush with places that shouldn't exist. Or maybe you're just someone who senses that the world is bigger, stranger, and more dangerous than most people realize. Whatever brought you to these pages, consider this both a warning and a guide. The backroads of America hide secrets that defy explanation. Thin spots exist where reality wears down, allowing something else to seep through. And once you've crossed over, even if you make it back, a part of you remains there forever. I don't know if Absaroki was always waiting for me, or if I simply took a wrong turn at the wrong moment. I don't know if the bearded man was once like me, a traveler who stayed too long and became part of the place. I don't know if I'm still being hunted or merely watched from across the divide. But I know this. The next time you're driving on a lonely road and come to an unexpected detour, think carefully before you turn. The destination on your map may not be the one waiting at the end of that road. And if you see an old Ford pickup in your rearview mirror, keeping a steady distance behind you. Don't stop. Don't look back. Just drive. And pray you find your way to the main road before nightfall. Because the long haul is never really over. The road goes on forever. And sometimes it leads to places we were never meant to go.